In this video, we're going to create an application that allows you to leave video suggestions for me. So you can type in any video suggestion you want, click create the suggestion. And the best part is all of this is going to be hooked up with the Notion API. So anything that you do is going to show up inside of Notion for me. And as you can see, that idea showed up right here. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be using the Notion API to store all of this information in this nice database structure. We can change things in here. For example, I could delete this, and now if I scroll down, you'll see that this item is at the very end here. And if I refresh the page and then I scroll back down, you can see that item has been removed. So everything is perfectly synced up with Notion using their API. And if you're unfamiliar with Notion, it's pretty much the best productivity and task management app that you can think of because it does literally everything. I mean, if you look over here, I use Notion for pretty much everything related to this entire YouTube channel. As you can see, every single YouTube video I have planned out inside of Notion here. I have all the information for things like timestamps, descriptions, title, thumbnail, and so on. You can also see that every single course that I create is planned out over here. So my JavaScript Simplified course, all of the details for every single video in that course is inside of Notion. I absolutely love it. It's by far the best application I use for planning things out. So when they reached out to me asking to sponsor this video to use the Notion API, I was like, yes, 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 please let me do this. So if you're interested in checking out Notion, you can use the link down in the description below. I absolutely love it, and their free tier is amazing. I mean, I use the free tier and I can do everything to run this entire channel on it. Now, in order to get started with the Notion API, you're obviously going to need an account, so you can create an account, and then we can go to their getting started documentation. And if we just scroll down here a little ways, the first thing we need to do is create a new integration, and we can just open up our integrations, which we click on up here. I'll just open that in a new tab for now, and we just need to create an integration, super simple, give it a name, logo, whatever you want. As you can see, I already have the test version of this, so let's just create a brand new integration. We're going to call it WDS Video Suggestion YouTube. There we go, because this is for the YouTube video, and you want to associate it with your workspace. I only have my one Web Dev Simplified workspace, so that's what we're going to associate it with, and then click Submit. And then here you're going to have your secret token. Make sure you don't share that with anyone at all, otherwise they could, do things on your workspace. And then it's just the rest of the information, and you want to just make sure here you have internal integration checked, because this is going to be something you only use inside of your own internal workspaces and not on other people's workspaces. Then once you have that done, if we go back here, we need to make sure that we can actually use our integration with the database. So if we go over here, let's just create a brand new database. So what I want to do is just click this plus button here to add a page, and we're going to make this a table. So it is a database, and let's just name this video suggestions, and we'll just say -YouTube here so we know which one we're working with. And then we need to click this share button. And what this allows us to do is actually share this with individual people. So if we click inside of here, you can see we can share with an integration. And I want to share with this YouTube integration right here. That's the one we just created. And essentially by doing that and clicking invite here, what we've done is we've linked this particular database we created in Notion with the integration that we just created over here. So now they actually have access to each other. If you don't do this step of sharing, when you try to read the database, you're going to get an error saying you don't have the permission. And that's because you haven't done this sharing step yet. Once we have that done, that's pretty much everything we need to do for this documentation. We've linked together these two items, and the next thing to do is actually set up our database. So we know here that we want to have a title for the video. We're going to have some tags. We're also going to have a text column, which is just going to be for a description like this. I want to have a simple check mark here that's going to be for whether or not this is a project-based video, so we can create a checkbox for that. And then what we're going to do finally right here is set a column for the count of the number of votes that we have. So let's make that a number column. And we can just reorder those if we want to. And let's add in a few tags here. We'll have it JavaScript. We're going to have CSS, HTML, and React. There we go. These are just going to be the different tags we have. And we can just get rid of these tags for now from here. We don't really need them all on this one. We can actually just go ahead and delete all of these placeholder values because right now our database is going to be completely empty. But we now have the different columns for the items inside of our database. So when we update and add things to this database, we can give it a title, a description, some tags, a project checkmark, and a number of votes. Now, once that's done, we're finally ready to start implementing this all into our application. So I just want to go back over to getting started here, and I want to click on the API reference. And this is all the documentation that we're going to need. The main important thing that we're going to be worried about right away is retrieving a database. This is how we're going to get all the information related to a particular database, and all we need to do is pass it a database ID. And to get that ID, we just go to the URL bar up here, and this is the ID for our database just straight into the URL. So we can kind of just copy that for now and use that where we need it. So now with that's done, let's just come over here, and we're going to create a .env file. Inside of here, we're going to put things such as our database ID. So we can say Notion database ID, and we're just going to paste that ID in there so we have it saved for now. And then what we need to do is just open up our terminal, and we need to start installing the libraries because we're just going to use a basic Express application. So I'm going to install Express, and we want to make sure we install the Notion library, which is Notion HQ/client. That's going to be the Notion API library we're going to be using in our Express server to actually query and save things into this database we created with Notion. Then we want to make sure that we have a server.js file. So let's just create that server.js file where everything's going to live. And in our package JSON, let's just make sure we do a quick npm init-y to give us all of the default values. And then for our script, we just want to have a dev start. And that dev start is just going to run nodemon server.js. And nodemon is just a library that we can install here real quick. So we'll say npm i-save dev nodemon, and this nodemon library essentially automatically refreshes our server every time we make changes, which is just going to make it so much easier for working with our application. Now lastly, let's make sure that we install the .env library so that we can actually load in all the environment variables, and we're going to install the library EJS so that we can use that as our templating library when we actually render out our views. So now in our server.js, let's start writing out the code we're going to need. The first thing I want to do is I want to require that .env library, and I'm going to call the config function. And all this does is it takes all the environment variables we define in our .env and puts them into the process.env. So we could say, Notion database ID, and this is going to give us the ID for our Notion database. Next, what I want to do is I want to get Express. So we'll say Express is equal to requiring Express. And then we can come down here and just say that app is equal to running that Express function. And we can say app.listen. We're going to say process.env.port, and we're just going to put that port into our .env. So we'll say our port is just going to be 3000. So now what we can do is we can actually run our application. We can say npm run dev start, which is that command we created in our package JSON. And now if we go to localhost on port 3000, you can see that our application is running. Right now it just says cannot get slash because we don't have any routes. So we could create an app.get at the slash location with a request and a response. And for now, we can just say res.send hi. And as you can see, if we just refresh, it's going to send out the text hi. So this is working as we expect. Now, if we wanted to start querying from Notion all of our information about our database, we could do it inside this file here, but I want to kind of split things out. So I'm going to create a separate file called Notion.js, where we're going to handle all of our Notion related code. So inside of here, I want to get the client, which is going to be coming from that Notion library. We can just require that from @notion/client-iq. And then we can actually set up our Notion instance, which is just being a new one of these clients. And we need to make sure we pass our authentication. And this authentication is something we're going to store in an environment variable. So we're going to say process.env.notion API key. And this Notion API key comes right here from your integrations. So if I just expand this out a little bit, we can click this show button and actually copy paste this token. This is something you're going to want to make sure that you don't share with anyone though. So I'm going to copy this over myself into our .env under that Notion API key, and then I'll get back to you. Okay, so I just finished copying that over, so we have that inside of our env. And like I said, just make sure you copy over your own environment variable. And now what we want to do is we want to look at this API request right here, which is retrieving a database. Well, in order to do that, we can just say notion.databases, because we're going to be asking about the databases, and we want to retrieve an individual database. And it's going to be taking a database underscore ID. So we can pass it a database underscore ID, and we know that that is process.env.notion database ID, just like that. This is going to get us our information about our database. And let's just turn this into a function called get database, and we're going to put the code inside of there. And then we're going to make this an asynchronous function. And that's just because all of these are fetch requests. They're going to be asynchronous. So we can await the response of this. And we're just going to say, we have our response here. So response is equal to that. And then what I want to do is I just want to console.log our response to see exactly what we're going to get. And we'll just call get database right here. And then in our server, we're just going to make sure we import that file. So we can say const notion is equal to require Notion, and this is going to be /Notion like that. And that should hopefully run the code inside of Notion.js, and it's going to log out the response. And as you can see down here, we actually are getting our response. So let me just make this a little bit bigger so we can see. As you can see, we get an object, which is a database. We have the ID, some other information about it. And then down here, we have all the important stuff. These are the different titles and properties of everything that we have going on. So this is like the title of our database. and properties are all the different rows inside of our database. So if we go over here, you can see that we have a title, a description, tags, and all of those things are shown up in here. We have title, description, tags, project, and votes. And also, most importantly, we have this ID field right here. What I want to do is I want to take this ID field and I actually want to store this inside of our environment variables. I'm going to open up our .env here, just scroll this down a little bit, and we're going to have a Notion votes ID, and that's going to be equal to this ID right here. I'm just going to copy it up, and I'm going to do that for every single one of these. Now that we have all those copied over, we've essentially made it so we can associate these different variables with the ID that belongs to the different rows and columns inside of our database. And that just means we don't have to rely on using names, because names are things that can change really often, and these IDs are never going to change. So it's much better to use IDs when possible. So now that we have that done, we don't really care about our database anymore at all. We don't even need this function anymore, because we're never going to get the details about the database. We're only going to be adding things to it. So let's create a quick function here that's called create suggestion. And this is going to be the function that actually creates a suggestion, and we're going to pass it in a suggestion, and this is going to be what adds it to our Notion database. Now, in order to figure out how to do this, let's just go reference the documentation right here. I'm going to make this a little bit wider so it's easier to see. And what we care about is our page objects, and we want to create a page, because a page is like an entry inside of a database. They just use the word page essentially as the terminology to describe anything. As you can see, we have a bunch of different parameters. We have a parent parameter, and this parent takes either a database or a page. In our case, it's going to be a database. So if we look over here, you can see we pass it a database ID. So we can do that actually pretty easily. Let's just come over inside of here. What we want to do is notion.pages.create, because we want to create a page, and we're going to pass it in our parent. And we know our parent is a database ID, and our database ID is just process.env.notion database ID. So that's that parent portion taken care of. That's pretty straightforward. The next thing is going to be the properties, where we store every single one of the properties we want to put into the database. So let's say properties, and this is going to be an object here. And if we just expand this out a little bit, you can see that this properties is going to be either a name, such as like name, or we can pass it the ID. As you can see right here, it says the keys are the names or the IDs of the property, and the values are the property values. And what we can do to figure out what we need to pass to this is click on this property values here. This is essentially going to describe how the values are actually laid out. So as you can see here, we can see everything about property values. And if we look on this right-hand side here, we have examples of what it looks like for each different type of object. So we have title, for example, we have a rich text right here. We scroll down, we have a number, and so on. The main thing that we care about is going to be our title property, because if we scroll this over real quick, you can see that in our properties, this title has an ID of title and a type of title. So we know this is a title style property. And in Notion, essentially the first name entry that's automatically populated in your database, that is going to be your title column. So we know that this has the type of title. And if we look at the example here, if we just expand this a little more, you can see that we need to specify essentially the name, or in our case, we use the ID. And then inside of that, we're going to say it's a title type. So we're going to put title. So let's just do that real quick. We'll expand this a little bit. Inside of here, we know we want to get our ID, which is process.env.notion title ID, which is what we saved in this .env right here. Then we know inside of that, we need to specify that we're going to have a title, and this title is an array of all the different rich text elements. And if we just scroll that back up here and expand this, we should be able to see that this section is going to have a type, and then it's going to have some text. Our type is text, so then we're going to have a text section that contains our content. So let's do just that. We know that we're going to have a type here. I'm sorry, this is going to be an object, and it's going to have a type of text. And then we're going to have a text property, and this is going to be an object that contains a piece of content. And this content is just going to be the title of our thing. So from our suggestion, we're going to get the title from that. So we know that whenever we create a suggestion, the title right here is what we're going to be typing in, and that's going to go into this title property. The next thing that we need to worry about is the next property. But before we do that, I want to just see if this works. I want to see if we can create a suggestion that has just a title. So if we create a suggestion, and let's just pass it the title of test, and then we're going to run this code. So when we save, it should hopefully run all of this code. And of course, we're getting an error. It's saying body.properties.title text content should be defined. Instead, it was undefined. The reason for that is because this should be an object with the property title. And now if we save and scroll down, we no longer have any errors. And if we go over to our database, you can see we created a new entry inside of it in Notion with that title of text. Now, the next thing I want to focus on is going to be our description, and our description is going to be a rich text field. If we scroll up here, you can see description, it is rich text. So if we scroll back down, expand this all the way until we get to rich text, you can see that a rich text field is pretty much identical to a title, except for, you can have multiple things in it if you really want. But for our case, we only really care about having one block. So it's going to look identical to the title, except for instead of saying title, this is going to say rich text. And this ID up here is going to be the ID for the rich text field. So let's do exactly that. We can scroll up here, make this a little smaller, and we just want to copy all of this code right here, paste it down, and instead of having our title ID, we're going to have our description ID. And instead of having our title here, this is going to be our description. And if you remember, this is going to be saying here, rich text, because this is a rich text field. Now we should hopefully be able to put in a description and it should show up as well. So let's try that. We have a title here for test, and we're going to have a description that's just going to say hello world. Let's just make sure I spelled description right. If we save that, you can see it looks like it ran properly. And if we come over here, we now have a test right here for our first example. We'll delete that. And our second one here now has the description of hello world. So that's working as we expect. The next section we had to worry about is tags, which I'm going to skip over for now just because it's a little more complicated. But otherwise, we have project, and if we scroll over a little ways, we have votes. So if we look at our page object here and we scroll down a little ways, we're going to skip the multi-select. We don't have any dates. We don't have any formulas. If we just keep going here, eventually we're going to find the number section. Here's the checkbox property. As you can see, a checkbox property value object contains a Boolean within the checkbox property. And if we expand this a little ways and we scroll until we find a checkbox on the side, as you can see, it's just our ID, and then checkbox is going to be either true or false. That's super straightforward. So let's do exactly that. What we want to do is just come down here with our next value, which is process.env.notion project ID. And this is going to be a single object that contains a checkbox, which is going to be true or false. So we're going to say is project, which we're going to get from up here. And it's going to be either true or false. So let's just say is project. We're going to set that to true. Now when we save and we go over, you can see that it's created that new object. And if we scroll over, this project check mark is checked because we passed in true here. While if we passed in false and we save, you're going to see it's going to create a brand new one that no longer has that box checked. So this is working as we expect. Finally, if we come back to here, we can search for the number section. So let me just expand this back out. You can see we have select, multi-select, dates, 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 and keep going a little ways. Checkboxes, numbers must be all the way up at the top. As you can see, here's number, and it's the same thing. It's just a number and then followed by number, almost identical to how checkbox is set up. So let's just copy this code. We're going to say that this is for our votes, and this is going to be a number, and the number is going to be our votes, which in our case, we can just put up here, votes. And let's say that we're going to have a votes of 3. So now if we come over, we can see that we've created an item and it has a votes of 3. So all of this is hooked up as we expect. Now the final thing we have left is going to be for our multi-select. So if we just expand this out and we find that multi-select, and this multi-select is just going to take the ID of our different tags, but we don't actually know the ID of these tags yet. We need to figure out those IDs. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a brand new function for getting all of the tags that we have defined here. As you can see, if we click on this, we have, JavaScript, CSS, HTML, React. We're going to create a function to get all of those. So let's just minimize this function for now. We're going to create a function and it's going to be called get tags. And this get tags function is going to query our database. So we're going to get our database, which is just going to be coming from awaiting notion.databases.retrieve. And we're going to retrieve the database with the correct ID. So database ID is database ID. That's going to get our database. And then what we need to do is we need to get our properties from our database. So for now, I'm just going to console.log out these properties to see what we're working with, comment this out, and make sure we call that get tags function. So now when we save, you can see we're of course getting an error. Let's see what that is. It's saying await is not valid because we need this to be an async function. That'll fix the error. And it's not fixing the error, and that's because this should say process.env.databaseID. And now, and of course, this is Notion database. There we go. That'll get rid of all of our errors here. And as you can see, now we're getting everything printed out again. We have this multi-select section right here. So we know that inside of properties, we need to get the tags. So if I just minimize this down, we can do properties.tags, and that's going to hopefully get us all of the tags. And as you see in multi-select, we have different options. So if we say .multi-select, we can look at what the options are. As you can see, each option just has an ID and a name and a color. So what I want to do is I want to take these properties, but I want to access the property via ID instead of via the name here. Because if we go back a little ways and save this, you can see that each one of these properties has an ID inside of it, which is what we're storing inside of our env variables here. So what I want to do is I want to take these properties, I want to convert them to essentially a key value pair that has the ID as the key. So we're going to create a simple function to do that. We're just going to call Notion properties by ID. And then we're just going to take in a list of properties. So all I want to do with this is I want to get all of the values from properties. That's going to be like each one of these objects. So we can say object.values. We can pass it in our properties. That's going to give us an array of all of these different objects here that are the values. And what we want to do is we want to reduce these down into a brand new object. So we're going to take our object and our individual property we're currently looping through. And by default, we want to start this out as an empty object. And all I want to do inside of here is I just want to get the ID, and I want to get all of the rest of the properties related to this. I'm going to extract that out into our property. So from our property, we're going to be pulling out the ID into its own variable, and all the rest of the information just stays in this rest variable. Then I'm going to return a brand new object, which is our current object, spread over with our ID element being added in there. So all that this code does right here is it takes this object right here that's based by names on votes, project, tags, and so on, and it takes the ID and it puts it out here. So now, if we just call this function with our properties here, and we run and save this code, you'll now see that the code being printed out is undefined. That's because I need to make sure I return from this function. Once I do, you can now see the IDs are used as the key, and all the information inside of here is just the values. So that's exactly how we want to be able to access this, because now what we can do is we can say that once we convert this information, we want to get the key for our multi-select. And we know that that is just process.env.notion tags ID. And we want to make sure we get the multi-select from that. And we need to get the different options. So now let's just return this for now, and we'll console log it down here. And as you can see, this is returning us a promise. And that's just because this is an async function. So let's just make sure we do .then with the results, and we'll console.log the results. We won't console log the whole thing. That'll actually give us the information we're looking for. And as you can see, it gives us an array here which has the ID, the name, and the color. We honestly really don't care about the color. So what we could do to make this a little bit easier, we could do a map here for each one of our options. And we could return a new option, which just is the ID of the option and the name of the option. And now if we save this and we scroll down, you can see now all we have is the ID and the name, which is all we really care about. So now if we just scroll down a little ways, we have our create suggestion function here. Well, we can pass in the tags that we want to add to this. And what we can do is go all the way down here, we can create another one of these process.env notion tags ID. And for the multi-select, we know we just put the text multi-select inside of here, and we need to pass it an array of all the different IDs. So we can take our tags, we can map through each tag, and we can just get the ID. So we can return the ID from our tag, just like that. That's going to give us this multi-select functionality. So we can create a new suggestion, and for our tags, we can just pass it in get tags like this. So we're going to be getting all of the different tags. We need to make sure we put this inside of the .then. So we're just going to use this .then that we have up here. This res is going to be all of our different tags. Put our create suggestion inside of here, and we're just going to pass in our tags just like that. So now we should be getting all of the tags from the database and putting all of them into the next suggestion we create. So if we save real quick, everything looks like it's running. And as you can see over here, we created a brand new object, and it has all 4 of the different tags because we passed in every single one of the tags to our thing. So now we can create an object with all the different parameters that we care about. The only important thing to note though is when we create a suggestion, I want it to automatically have a votes of 0. So what we're going to do, instead of passing the votes in here, we're just going to automatically default our votes to 0, because everything we create, we want to start with absolutely 0 votes on it because nobody's voted on this idea yet. So now that should be everything for create suggestion done. We can kind of delete this code so we aren't constantly creating a bunch of things. And I want to come down here and just say module.exports. And I want to put that create suggestion function in here, as well as the get tags function, so we can use both of these functions inside of the rest of our code. So now in order to start hooking things up, let's go over to our server and let's actually send down a file from here instead of just sending down the text hi. We can say res.render, and we're going to render a page called index. And this is going to be our index page, which we're going to create inside of a folder called views. And this is going to be a file called index.ejs. And the reason we're using an EJS file here is because we're using the EJS handler for actually rendering out all of our code and making our templating work. Now, the next thing we need to do is actually make it so we have all of the code inside of our form. And to make the styling really easy, we're going to be using Bootstrap for this. So we can just scroll down to the CSS section here. We can just copy this right here. And we can paste it into our document, and that's going to be the Bootstrap CSS that we're using. And then we can actually create the form that we want. And our form is just going to have a title, description, tags, and the project checkbox. So to get started, I'm just going to create a div, and it's going to have the class container and the class my4 to give it a little bit of spacing. And inside of here, we're going to have an h1 that just says WDS video suggestions. That's just going to be the title of our page. And then we can actually create our form right here. And this form is going to have an action, which is going to go to /create suggestion, which is going to be an endpoint we're going to create. And we're going to make sure that this is a post method. So we'll say method of post, just like that. And also I'm going to give it a little bit of a border on the bottom. So we're going to say class is border bottom. There we go. Then inside of our form, what we need to do is we need to set up some rows and some columns. So we can say we're going to have a row, and then inside of the row, we're going to have a column, which is going to be 12 wide on the small screens, or it's going to be equally split on medium and above screens. And we're also going to give it some margin on the bottom. This is going to be essentially a row or a column inside of our row for storing a form field. So we're going to have a label, and this label is just going to say title, and it's going to be for our title property. And then it's going to say title inside of here. And then we're going to have an input. And this input is a type of text. So we can say text right here. And it's going to have a name of title, an ID of title. It's going to be required. And we're going to make sure we give it the class of form control. Now, before we get too much further, let's just see if this looks good. We can go over to our page, refresh, and we need to make sure we specify our default view engine. So we can just say app.use, and we want to use a view engine, and we want to use EJS. Instead of use, this should say set because we want to set the view engine. And we also want to make sure we set our path. So we can say app.set of views is going to be /views. And we're just saying, hey, all of the views for our application live in this views folder here. So now if we refresh, you can see that we're rendering out that input for our title right here, which is exactly what we want. Now the next thing we need to do is obviously render out our next input. So let's copy this code down. And this is going to be for each one of our different tags. So for our label, we're going to change this to tag IDs. And instead of using an input, we're going to be using a select. And this select is going to have a name of tag IDs. It's going to have an ID of tag IDs. And it's going to have a class, which is form select. And we want to be able to select multiple of them. So we're going to make sure our multiple is set to true. Then inside of here, we're going to put all of our different options. And to render out our options, we're actually going to pull our tags in from our server. So when we render our page, we're going to pass down all of the different tags for this as well. And to get those tags, we're going to be getting them from Notion. So what we could do here is, we could say like notion.getTags, like that. But I don't really want to do that because that's going to render the tags every single time we render our page. And honestly, these tags don't change very often. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to store our tags out in our server. So let's just import getTags from up here. And then I want to create a variable called tags. And then inside of a set interval, like this, what I want to do is I want to run the code to get our tags. So we can just say that tags is equal to awaiting get tags. Make sure this is an async function. And we're going to run this like, let's say every hour. So we can say like 1000 times 60 times 60. So every hour we're going to update our tags. And now down here, we can just make sure we pass the tags down to this index file. So inside of our index file here, we have access to the tags and we can loop through them by saying tags.for each one of our tags. And this is going to be using that EJS syntax. And all this syntax is saying is, hey, run this JavaScript code right here and then do something. So let's just make sure that we have this as an actual function. And inside this function, we just want to render out an option tag. So we're going to render out an option. It's going to have a value, and that value is going to be equal to our tag.id. And then inside of here, we're going to put the label, which is just our tag.name. And this equal sign just means render out whatever you put inside of here, while when we don't have the equal signs, it just means run the code, but don't return the value. So now if we save this and refresh, we're of course getting an error. And all this error is saying here, let's just read it. It says type error for each of undefined. So saying tags is undefined. The reason for that is because if we go back to our server, we're only running this once every hour. We need to make sure that we first populate our tags with a default value. So let's default it to an empty array. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say we're going to say get tags. And inside this get tags, we're just going to call .then. It's going to have some data. And then we're going to say our tags is equal to our data. Now that should hopefully work. So now if we refresh over here, you can see we're getting all of our different tags. And the reason we had to do this is first we have to initially populate this value, and then every hour we're going to run this set interval to re-update it with new tags if they change. Now if we go back into here, we need to essentially create a brand new row. So I'm going to create just an MB3, This is going to give me some margin on the bottom. And inside of here, I'm going to have a label. And this label is for our description. So we can just say description like this. And then we're going to have an input with the type of, I'm sorry, not an input. It's going to be a text area. And the text area is going to be a description text. Description. We don't really care about these columns or rows. So I'm going to get rid of that. I am going to give it a class though of form control. And I'm going to make sure that is required. Whoops. Required. And also I'm going to put a max length on here, which is just going to be 500 characters. I don't want this to be a really super long text area. So now if we save refresh, we have our description right here. I'm going to copy this down one more time. And this is going to be for our checkbox. So we're going to give this a class of form check. So we know this is a checkbox area. And then inside of here, we need to put an input. And the input is the type of checkbox. The name is going to be is project. The ID is project. And we need to make sure here that we give it a class, which is form check input. We don't need this text area anymore. This label is for our checkbox, which is called is project. We're just going to call this project. And we also need to give this a class, just so it works with Bootstrap, of form check label. Just like that. So now if we refresh one more time, you can see we now have that checkbox for our project. And the last thing to do is to put in our button. And this button is going to be a submit button. And it's just going to say create new suggestion. And what we want to do is we want to say that the class is going to be button primary. And let's just put a little margin on the bottom as well. Now if we save that, refresh, we can now see we have that button here, and we can actually use this to submit to our form. So if we just type in some information and we click create new suggestion, you'll see it says it cannot post to /create suggestion. That's because in our server, we don't have anything for app.posting to /create suggestion. So now that we have this, we can actually use this to create a suggestion. So the first thing I want to do is get all the information from the body. So we can say that we're going to be getting the title, the description, the is project, and the tag IDs, which I'm going to make sure I default to an empty array just in case you don't specify any. That's going to be coming from our request.body. And the reason that these names are as they are is because in our index.js, we said is project, description, and so on as the name for each one of these different inputs. Then once we have all those values, we just want to create something. So we're going to say notion.create suggestion. And we just called this create suggestion. We don't need to put the notion in front of it. And what I want to do is I want to pass in the title. I want to pass in the description. I want to pass in the is project. And this is project is interesting because it's either going to be null or it's going to be some value. So if is project is not equal to null, then that means it's been selected. And if it's null, then that means it hasn't been selected. And then finally, we have our tags. And the interesting thing about a multi-input select box is that if you select one thing, it'll come back as an object that's not an array. So we need to make sure we properly render this as an array. So we can just say array.isArray. And this will allow us to check right here if tag IDs is an array. If it is, we're just going to use it as is. Otherwise, we're going to convert this tag IDs to an array because it's currently not an array. Then I want to map over that. And what I want to do is I want to take h tag ID. And inside of here, I just want to return the ID only. So we can say ID tag ID, just like that. So we're only getting the ID portion of this because that's all that we care about because we have a tag ID and I want to convert it to an object that has an ID. Now with all that done, we should be able to create our suggestion. So I just want to await this. So we wait for it to finish. And then what we can do is we can just say res.redirect. Now we're going to redirect people back to the home page. So now let's just refresh this. As you can see, it wants to confirm the form submission. We can say that's fine, that's okay. It's going to render through. As you can see, we're having an error because this is not an async function. There we go. Now if we refresh and resubmit, hopefully that'll work. But of course, we're getting another error, it looks like, saying cannot destructure property title of request.bodies, it's undefined. And that's because we need to actually use something for our app. We need to say app.use express.url encoded. And we just need to make sure we pass inside of here extended true. That'll allow us to actually parse parameters coming from the URL. Now with that saved, we can do this one more time to refresh. We get another error, so let's check this out real quick. This error says tag IDs is not defined. So if we scroll up here, you can see we have tag IDs just fine, but I called it tags IDs. So it should say tag ID and not tags IDs. Now, hopefully you can see we have no errors. This rendered through properly. And if we come over here, you can see we just created that brand new thing that has the title, description, and the tags that we specified. So now the next step is going to be actually rendering out each one of our suggestions. So in our app.get, we want to get all of our different suggestions. So inside of a Notion, we need to create a function to do that. we can say function get suggestions. Inside of this function, what we want to do is we want to get all the Notion pages, which is just going to be awaiting notion.databases, and we want to call the query method this time. So we need to pass it in the database ID, which is just process.env.notion database ID. And then what we need to do is pass in properties for how we want to sort this. So we're going to say we're going to have a sorts property, and this sorts property is going to take in a property, and this property is what we want to sort by. So we want to sort by the ID of process.env for our votes, because we want the most voted ones to show up first. And we can specify the direction as descending to make sure the one with the most amount of votes is going to show up at the very top of our list. Then what we need to do is actually take what this returns to us as a Notion object and convert it to a much easier to use object that has like title, description, is project, and tags, and so on. So what we're going to do is we're just going to say that we want to return this Notion pages, and we want to take the results, which is going to be all the different pages, and we want to map through those, and we want to call a function called from Notion object. This is a function we're just going to create. Notion object. This is going to take in a Notion page, and it's going to return to us an object that looks much more like this. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get all of our properties by ID. And that's just going to be Notion properties by ID, that function we created earlier. We're going to pass it in our Notion page, and we want to get the properties from that page. Then what we can do is use those to actually get the individual values we care about. So here we want to get the ID. That's just Notion page.id. And then each one of our properties we care about are going to be title, we have votes, we have tags, we have is project, and then finally description. These are all the different things we care about. The title is going to come from our properties by ID. We want to get that variable, which is our Notion title ID. And here we're going to be getting the title property, which is an array, and we want to get the plain text from that. And this is very similar to how when we set the properties, remember how we had to set a title property and it was an array, we had to set the first value in that. Well, what we're doing is we're just getting the first value from the array and getting the plain text from it. We need to do a similar thing for our votes. I'm just going to copy this. But if you remember when we set a number property, all we did is set the property called number. So here what we can do is we can just say dot number, and that's going to get us the number property from the votes ID here. Then for our tags, it's going to be a little bit different because we have that multi-select we need to worry about. So let's get the tags ID. We know here we have a multi-select. And what we want to do is we want to map over this multi-select, and we want to get just the ID and the name. So for each one of our options, what we want to do is we want to return a new object which has the ID of our option and it has the name of our option, just like that. Pretty straightforward. For our votes, or for our is project, it's going to be almost identical as to what we did for votes. So we're just going to change this to project ID. And this, if you remember correctly, is just a checkbox. And our description is almost identical to title. So we're just going to copy this down. But instead of saying .title, this is rich text. And we want to get here the content. So we can say .text, .content. And then inside of here, this is the Notion description ID. And this is all that you can find straight from the Notion documentation if you want to look up how to do it for more complicated use cases. But with that saved, that's pretty much everything we need for this function right here. Now what we need to do is just come up here, make sure that this is an async function, and then we can export that down here, get suggestions, and we can actually use it inside of our server. So let's import get suggestions right here, and then we need to get those suggestions inside of here. So we'll make this an async function, and we can say const suggestions is equal to awaiting of get suggestions. And this is going to get us the 100 most upvoted suggestions because you only get the first 100 unless you implement pagination and can actually page through to more other options. So now let's just make sure we pass those suggestions down to our page like this. There we go. We have our suggestions being passed in. And now instead of our index.ejs, we can actually render out our suggestions down here after our form. So we're going to create a row, and I'm going to give it a gap of 3, so there's some spacing between each one of our items. And then I want to loop through each one of our suggestions. So we're going to say suggestions, suggestions dot for each suggestion. And for each one of these, let's just make sure we close all this stuff off. What we're going to do is we're essentially going to render out a bootstrap card, and we're going to do it inside of a column. So we're going to say by default, it's going to be a 12 wide column. On a small screen, it's going to be 6 wide. On a medium screen, it's going to be 4 wide. And on a large screen, we're going to have it be 3 ride. So we're just going to kind of implement it like that. And then what we want to do is we want to get our actual card element. So we're going to create a card just like that. Inside of our card, we're going to have a card header, which is going to be flexbox displayed. So we're going to deflex this. We're going to justify our content in the center. I'm sorry, between. That way we have space between our different items. And we're going to align our items in the center. And that's because we're going to have our text inside of here, and we're going to have our button as well inside of here. Let's just make sure I specify that all correctly. There we go. Then inside of our header, like I said, we're going to have our title on one side. So we'll just put that inside of a div, and we'll just say that we're going to have our suggestion.title, close that off. And then inside of a different div, what we're going to do is we're going to have our actual vote section. So we're going to have a span which contains the number of votes. And this span here is just going to say suggestion.votes. That's just the count of votes that we have. And then we're going to have a button for doing the upvoting. So we're just going to call this our data upvote button. And we'll give a class here with px1, py0. That just kind of changes around the padding on this. And we'll make it a blue primary button. And we're going to put a plus symbol inside of it to denote that this is for upvoting a suggestion. Also on this, we're going to put a class, which is me2. That's going to give us a little bit of margin or spacing between these items. And then also we want to make sure we specify this as data upvote count so that we can increment this later inside of our JavaScript. Also here, we're going to put some classes for some styling. We're just going to say this is going to be flexbox. We're going to justify the content in the center, and we're going to align the items in the center as well. So let's just take a look at what this looks like. If we refresh our page, we're of course getting a bunch of errors. It's saying cannot read property number of undefined. So if we go into our Notion API where that is occurring, that's from Notion object right here. It's saying cannot read .number from Notion votes ID. Now the reason I believe this is occurring is because in our database, we have a few items, if we scroll over, that don't have any votes. So I'm just going to remove these items that don't have any votes, and hopefully that'll fix our problem. So now if we come over here and we just refresh our page, you can see that did fix our problem. And it's a little hard for you to see, so let me just turn my camera off. But we now have 3 different items down here. They have their upvote counters next to them, and they have the correct titles. Obviously, the next step is going to be actually putting the information inside of these. So back in our index.ejs, first of all, what I want to do is I want to put a little margin on the top here. We'll just say MT3. That'll give us a little space between our cards and this bottom border here. That looks pretty good. And now we can work on our card body. So let's collapse this down, and we're onto our card body. And inside the card body, we just want to put essentially all of the different information. So I want to put a description. So inside of a p tag, we'll say suggestion.description, just like that. Then what I want to do is create a bunch of different badges. So if it's a project, I'll create a badge for it being a project. So if the suggestion is a project, well, then what we're going to do is just close this off, open this up. And inside of here, we're going to create a div with a class of badge, and it's going to be a blue badge. So we'll say background primary, and we're going to make it a pill shape by saying rounded pill, and this will just say project. So if we do a quick refresh right now, you can see we have the description inside of all of these. And if any of them were actually specified as a project, which one of them is, so it should be showing up with a blue pill, but for some reason it is not. If we do a little bit of looking, it looks like I spelled this wrong. It should be BG primary. Now if we save and refresh, you can now see that actually properly shows up as we expected. It has that nice project badge. Now the last thing I want to do is create essentially a badge for each one of the tags. So we can just loop through our different tags by saying suggestion.tags.for each one of our tags. What I want to do is just close this off. And inside of here, I want to create another badge. So I'm just going to copy this, but this is going to be a secondary badge. And inside the text of it, we're just going to specify that this is our suggestion, or I'm sorry, our tag.name, and close that off. So now if we refresh, hopefully any of them that have tags, you'll see they show up as these gray little pills. And I think that looks really good. And now when we create a new suggestion, if we just say test1, let's say it's going to be a JavaScript, we'll say test2, make it a project, click create, and now you can see that that's not showing up. Let's just give our page a quick refresh to make sure that it's not a fluke, and there it is right there, test1, test2, and it is showing up. So it just wasn't showing up right away for some reason. So now really the last step is to make it so this upvote button actually does something so we can vote on different ideas. So we're going to go into Notion again. We're just going to minimize out a bunch of this information and we're going to create a brand new function called upvote suggestion. And this is going to take in a page ID. And what I want to do is I want to get our suggestion to figure out how many upvotes it does have. So we're going to say await get suggestion. And we're going to pass it in our page ID. And that's going to be a function we're also going to create called get suggestion, which takes a page ID. And this one actually is going to be pretty straightforward. Let's make sure it's async. And we're just going to return awaiting from here the notion.pages. And we want to get an individual page, which is just retrieve. We can pass it in a page ID just like that. And we also want to make sure we convert this from a Notion object. So we'll say from Notion object, and we'll pass in the return of this. And this we need to make sure is awaited, and we can remove the await out here. So that should hopefully get us a suggestion, but of course we're getting an error. Await is only valid in an async function. Let's make sure this is an async function, and that gets rid of the error for us. Now what we need to do is we need to get our votes. So our votes is just our suggestion.votes plus 1, since we're just adding 1 vote every time we do an upvote. And now what I want to do is I want to take our Notion pages and I want to update it. So we'll say notion.pages. I want to update a page. And this page I'm updating has the page ID, which is our page ID. And we want to update the properties of it. We want to specifically update our votes ID. So we'll say process.env.notion votes ID. And we want to update the number property of this to be our new value of votes. And then lastly, return our new upvote count right here. So now we can take this upvote suggestion and return it here. Now in order to do an upvote, let's just come into our server here. And we're just going to create a brand new app.post. This is going to be /upvote suggestion. And what we need to do is make this async. So we'll say async request response. There we go. And inside of here, I just want to get our votes, which is going to be for not Notion, it's going to be upvote suggestion, which we're going to make sure we import up here. And we're going to make sure that's awaited because this returns us the vote count. And we're going to pass in the request.body.suggestion ID. And in order to read the values from our body, we need to make sure up here that we say app.use express.json just like that. So now we can actually read the value of our votes, and then we can just res.json back our votes like this. So that's all it takes for this function. Super straightforward. We'll save that. In our index.ejs, we need to make sure we can actually reference the ID. So we're just going to put that on our card. We'll say data suggestion ID, and we're just going to make sure we link that really quickly here to our suggestion.id. So now we have a way to link those together. So when we click on our button, which we remembered if we look inside the header here, minimize that and open up this, we called it data upvote button, and we have our data upvote count, and we have our data suggestion ID. So we can access all this from a script file. So we'll create a public folder, which we'll drag out to the root here, and we're going to create a script.js file, which we're going to put inside of that public folder. Then inside of our index.ejs, at the very, very top, we need to make sure we have a script with a source, which is script.js, and we're going to make sure we defer this to load after the rest of our page. And in our server, we need to make sure that we actually specify that we're going to have this public folder. So we can say app.set, and we want express.static, and this is going to be in the public folder. And this should actually say app.use here instead of set. So this will specify where our public folder is, which is just right here. And now we can actually run our JavaScript inside of here. So what I want to do is on our document, what I want to do is I want to add an event listener to a click event. And inside of here, I just want to see what we're clicking on. So if the e.target.matches, and if it matches that data upvote button selector that we created, then what I want to do is I want to run some code called handle upvote, and I want to pass it in our button, which is our e.target. Then we can create that function handle upvote. It's going to take in our button, and the very first thing I want to do is I just want to disable our button. So we're going to specify that to true, and then somewhere at the bottom of our function we want to undisable it so we can re-click it again later. Then what I want to do is I want to get the ID of our suggestion, which is just the button. We want to get the closest parent that has that data suggestion ID, What we need to do is actually specify this as our suggestion card. This is like the parent of everything. Now what I can do with that information is I can make a fetch, which is going to go to /upvote suggestion. And inside this fetch, we want the method to be post. We want to make sure we specify a header here, and that's going to be for our content type. So we're going to say content type, and that's going to be application/JSON. And we also want to make sure we pass in our body. And our body is just going to be a stringified version of a JSON object that contains that suggestion ID. And that comes from our suggestion card.dataset.suggestion ID. And that's just what we saved inside of our HTML. Then we can take the response and we can convert it to JSON so we can actually use it. And then finally, that JSON response is just going to be our votes property. So what we can do inside of here is we can actually update our vote count. So we can say that our upvote count is just going to be our suggestion card.query selector. And if you remember correctly, we had a data upvote count property that we specified on that HTML element. And what we can do is just say upvote count is going to be text content equal to our votes. And then what I want to do to actually get our button working again is we can say finally. This is going to run after our promise finishes, and we're going to undisable our button so it'll be enabled again. So now with all that done, hopefully if we refresh our page, we don't have any errors, and we can click on this plus button, and it's going to disable our button. It's going to go and it's going to upvote this. And if we check inside of our database, you can see our vote count has been changed to 4. We click on this one that has a 0, and we come over here, you can see it now has a vote of 1. And that's all it takes to create this Notion-based project. If you want to submit your own ideas, I'll leave a link down to the live version of this application. And also don't forget to check out Notion because they're an incredible application for productivity and task management. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.